It was a quiet Monday morning in Ouagadougou when a sealed envelope stamped with a golden American eagle arrived at the presidential office of Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was in a private meeting with his ministers when his aide rushed in, holding the letter as if it were a ticking bomb. "It's from Donald Trump," the aide whispered. Everyone froze. The room grew tense as Traoré carefully opened the envelope. It was an official invitation from U.S. President Donald Trump himself, inviting Traoré to a peace talk at the White House. The letter was polite. It spoke of reconciliation, shared prosperity, and restoring confidence between the West and African leadership. But something in Traoré's eyes shifted as he read the final paragraph. His hand trembled slightly. He put the letter down, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. "Why now?" he asked softly. No one answered. The room felt colder. That evening, Traoré sat silently by the window of his private quarters, watching children play in the distance. The invitation was tempting. But deep in his heart, something painful had been stirred, a truth too raw to ignore. And he knew he could not accept. The next morning, the sun rose quietly over Ouagadougou, but inside the palace, storm clouds were gathering. International media had already picked up whispers of the invitation. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera ran headlines. Trump reaches out to Africa. Burkina Faso's leader to visit White House. But Traoré wasn't celebrating. He was remembering. He called for his childhood friend Issa, now an advisor. When Issa entered, Traoré didn't speak right away. Instead, he pulled out an old, yellowed photo from his desk drawer. It showed a small boy, barefoot, staring at the ruins of his school, bombed during a Western-backed operation decades ago. "That boy is me," Traoré said quietly. "I was 9. Issa looked down, his eyes moist. "I thought I had buried this pain," Traoré continued. "But Trump's letter, it brought everything back." He stood up and walked to the window again. "They want a handshake, but they never apologized." Issa stayed silent. And then, Traoré said the words that changed everything. "I won't go. Not for smiles. Not for cameras. Not until they speak the truth." Issa whispered, "Then you must tell the world why." The global media waited, curious and hungry. Would Ibrahim Traoré fly to Washington? Would he shake hands with Trump? Instead, at exactly 8 p.m. local time, Burkina Faso's national channel went live. The broadcast was simulcast worldwide. Traoré walked into a brightly lit studio, wearing a simple uniform. No medals, no suit, just the quiet power of a man carrying generations of pain. He stood behind the podium. "My brothers, my sisters, people of Africa, and to those watching around the world." The room was silent. "I have received an invitation from former U.S. President Donald Trump," he said. He held up the letter. "But I cannot go." A gasp rippled through the crowd. He continued, voice firm but trembling. "I do not seek enemies, but I seek truth. My people were chained, used, and silenced for centuries. My own school was flattened, my childhood stolen, and now they want to smile for cameras." The audience was frozen. "I reject the invitation with respect, but also with memory, with grief, and with dignity." He paused. "And I am not alone." Within minutes, hashtags flooded Twitter. He said no. Africa remembers. Traoré speaks truth, and the world waited for what he'd say next. Just 2 hours after Traoré's live broadcast ended, the call came. Not from a secretary, not from a diplomat. Donald Trump himself was on the line. "Put him through," Traoré said, his voice calm. His aides held their breath. The line crackled. Then, "Captain Traoré," Trump began, voice slower than usual. "That was, quite a speech." Traoré said nothing. "I just wanted to understand," Trump continued. "Why turn down peace? You could have made history." Traoré responded gently. I'm not against peace. I'm against pretending nothing happened. There was a pause. Trump tried again. You're a strong man, but strong men also forgive. Traoré's tone didn't change. I can forgive, Mr. Trump, but I cannot forget. Africa's story wasn't just slavery, it was erasure. We were made invisible. Until now. Another long silence. Then Traoré added quietly, and sometimes, refusing an invitation is how you make history. Trump hung up without a word. Later that night, alone in his office, Traoré opened his journal and wrote 5 words. We owe the dead dignity. And somewhere in the world, a young African boy watched that clip and began to cry. 3 days passed. Traoré's speech had gone viral, not just in Africa, but across the world. Protesters in Accra, Kinshasa, and Nairobi marched with banners that read, Traoré spoke for us. But inside the presidential palace, Traoré's heart was heavier than ever. His assistant brought him a package. No sender, she said, just your name, handwritten. He opened it slowly. Inside was a bundle of letters, aged, crumpled, and stained, each written by African soldiers forced to fight for colonial powers in World War II. They were real letters, donated anonymously by a historian. One read, We bled for France. We died for Britain. But when we returned, we were not even allowed to walk on the same roads we fought to protect. Another simply said, I killed a man for a country that would not bury me with honor. Tears filled Traoré's eyes. He read all night, and by morning his voice was gone. He'd been reminded of something raw. Africa has always been asked to forgive, but never allowed to grieve. And he knew he had to speak again. This time, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. The next Sunday, Traoré visited his village, not as a president, but as a son of the soil. No cameras, no press, just dust, trees, and memory. He walked barefoot through the fields where his grandfather once tilled the earth with broken hands. He sat beside the grave of his uncle, a freedom fighter who was tortured in a colonial prison, his name still missing from official records. As he sat under the mango tree, an old woman approached. Her voice shook as she spoke. You remind me of your father, she said. He once told me, if you let the people forget, their chains will return without noise. Traoré looked at her, his eyes red. I haven't forgotten, he whispered. She placed her wrinkled hand on his chest. Then say it louder. That night, Traoré returned to the capital. He called a press conference, but this time, he didn't speak from a podium. He sat on the ground, with war letters and village soil beside him, and whispered, Africa is not a guest. We do not need to be invited to dignity. Millions watched, and across the world, hearts broke open. 2 days after his village speech, Traoré sat quietly in his office. His phone buzzed. An email had slipped through to his personal inbox, one not many people had access to. The subject line read, I watched your speech. I have something you need to see. He almost ignored it, but something made him open it. The message was short. My grandfather worked as an archivist in France. He saved a box of records that were meant to be destroyed. They detail what was done to African soldiers after World War II. It includes names, photos, and confessions. Attached was a single scanned image, a black and white photo of African soldiers being forced to dig their own graves after refusing to fight in a new colonial war. One of the names listed beneath the photo, Traoré's great-uncle. The blood drained from his face. He had always been told his great-uncle died in training. He never imagined this. He forwarded the image to his head of security and whispered, We are not fighting history. We are fighting silence. That night, Traoré didn't sleep. He was beginning to see the real reason behind the invitation, and it scared him. The White House couldn't stay quiet anymore. By now, the entire internet was boiling. TikTok videos of young Africans crying during Traoré's speech had hit over 40 million views. Even U.S. college students were sharing it under the tag, "For African Dignity." Then it happened. A press release from Donald Trump's office. The statement read, "Former President Trump has always believed in strong global leadership. He invited Captain Traoré to discuss future cooperation, not dwell on ancient history." CNN aired it live. The backlash was instant. On African news outlets, commentators were furious. He called it ancient history. Slavery and colonization are not ancient. They're scars we still live with. Traoré's team huddled in silence. He finally spoke. "They are trying to push us into shame." Then he stood up and faced his press secretary. "I will respond, but not with anger, not with hate, with truth." He walked out of the room, his mind spinning. He didn't just want to refuse the invitation anymore. He wanted to teach the world something it had forgotten. But first, he needed one more thing. He needed the box from the email. 3 days later, under heavy security, a private flight arrived in Ouagadougou from Marseille. A single passenger stepped off, a young woman named Elea, holding a dusty metal box close to her chest. She was the granddaughter of the archivist. "I smuggled it out when I was 17, she told Traoré quietly. "I couldn't let history disappear." Inside the box were handwritten testimonies from African soldiers tortured for refusing colonial orders, photos of men shackled, faces blurred with fear. A letter from a French general who wrote, "These men are brave but dangerous. If they return home with pride, they may awaken others." Traoré couldn't breathe. He pulled out a photo of a child next to a man in uniform. "That's my great-uncle," he whispered, "and that is my father." The room went silent. Elea asked, "What will you do with it?" He looked up, eyes burning. "I will show it to the world, not for revenge, but so no African child will ever again feel like their story doesn't matter." He clutched the box and walked out of the room. This was no longer just a political moment. It had become personal. The box sat on the long presidential table. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stared at it in silence. His ministers sat around him waiting for direction. Some looked nervous, others curious. "This could create serious diplomatic tension," his foreign minister whispered. Traoré didn't blink. He slowly opened the box. Each document inside was heavier than gold. There were signed orders to silence African veterans, diaries from French and British officers, even old telegrams referencing secret graves no one had ever spoken of. He stood. "I will reveal this," he said calmly, "not to humiliate anyone, but to finally give voice to those who were erased." One minister objected. "What if America cuts aid? What if they label you a threat?" Traoré looked him in the eye. "I'm not afraid of labels. I'm afraid of silence." That night, alone in his office, he wrote one sentence on a notepad. "Let the world see us. Let them weep with us." Then he made the call. A global TV special. Live. 1 hour. No script. No filters. For the first time in modern history, a sitting African head of state would reveal what empires tried to bury. And the world was not ready. The date was set. Saturday, 8 p.m. GMT. CNN, Al Jazeera, France 24, and even Sky News agreed to carry it live. Social media buzzed like never before. Will Traoré reveal classified documents? Why did he reject Trump? What's in the box? In Ouagadougou, the national stadium filled with thousands. In Nairobi, Dakar, Johannesburg, and Bamako, crowds gathered in public squares to watch. Even in Paris and New York, African immigrants tuned in. The broadcast began. Traoré walked onto the stage alone. No music, no flags, just the box and a table. He placed his hand over his heart. "I was offered a seat at a table in the White House. I chose to sit at the table of history instead." Then quietly, he held up the first letter. This is the confession of a colonial general who ordered African soldiers to dig their own graves in 1957. The stadium was still. Many of them had already fought for Europe, yet they were discarded, buried in silence, buried in shame. He paused. His voice cracked. My great-uncle was one of them. The camera zoomed into his face. His lips trembled, but he continued. The world began to cry. Halfway through the speech, even the camera operators were wiping their eyes. Traoré didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply read the truth. One by one, he revealed a diary entry from a French officer describing African children forced to carry ammunition. A letter from a Togolese soldier begging to be buried in his home village after being shot by accident in training. A photograph of women from Burkina Faso forced to clean colonial camps with bare hands while singing the French anthem. Every word was slow, heavy, honest. Then Traoré looked straight into the camera. I do not hate America. I do not hate Europe. I do not seek revenge. But I ask, is peace possible without truth? Is friendship real if one side is told to forget while the other side refuses to remember? In that moment, something changed. Twitter crashed, Facebook flooded, even critics went silent. And in a classroom in Ghana, a 12-year-old boy watching on his teacher's phone whispered, "He's speaking for my grandfather." That night, Traoré didn't go home. He walked the streets of Ouagadougou barefoot, just like his ancestors once did, and the people followed in silence. 3 days after the global broadcast, Ibrahim Traoré received word of a visitor. She came unannounced, no cameras, no media. Her name was Miriam Collins, a 74-year-old retired nurse from Alabama. She had watched his speech live, alone, in her small kitchen, and she had wept. I don't want to speak to the president, she told the guards. I want to speak to the man who carries the pain. Traoré invited her in. She handed him a small book wrapped in a cloth. My grandfather was a U.S. Army officer posted in Africa during the 1940s, she said softly. He kept this diary. He never let anyone read it. After he died, I did. Inside were pages of regret, confessions of how African soldiers were denied medical care, how young boys were pushed to carry crates under sunstroke, how wounded African fighters were left behind while white troops were evacuated. I had no idea, she whispered, tears falling. I thought we were always the good guys. Traoré closed the book gently. Miriam, he said, your courage brings healing. She held his hand, and for the first time in days, he cried too. The world was no longer calm. After Traoré's speech and Miriam's diary, global protests erupted. In Burkina Faso, people carried candles and old photos of grandparents who fought but were never honored. In Paris, African youth knelt outside the French Parliament, holding signs that read, "We bled for your flags. Now tell the truth." Even in Washington, D.C., African Americans stood outside the White House chanting, "Traoré speaks, we listen." The media tried to spin it. Some called Traoré divisive, others called him brave. But no one could ignore what was happening. On social media, millions of young people posted videos of their grandparents sharing stories they had never told before, of war, hunger, racism, betrayal. Traoré watched in silence. He wasn't celebrating, he was grieving, because truth had finally broken through the surface. But with it came decades of pain that had been locked away. He called his communications officer. "I want to speak one more time," he said. "One final message, not as a president, as a son of Africa." He had one more secret to reveal, and when the world heard it, they would never see Africa the same way again. A week after the protests erupted, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in a quiet studio. No stage, no flags, just a wooden chair and a single spotlight. He held one final document in his hands, something he hadn't even shown his ministers, a faded envelope from his own father, written years before he passed away. Traoré had never opened it, until now. He unfolded the letter slowly and began reading aloud. "My son, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here. I never told you what really happened to your uncle. They didn't just kill him. They forced him to lead young boys into a minefield to test for safety. He walked forward, singing. He told them, 'If I die, let my soul wake the next generation.' He stepped, and he never returned. We buried his shirt, not his body." Traoré stopped. His hands were shaking. "My father wanted me to forget, but I cannot, because forgetting him would mean killing him twice." He looked into the camera. Then he whispered, "Now you know why I said no." And across the world, millions wept. A day after reading his father's letter, Captain Traoré received a call from the most unexpected place, a private school in Mississippi, USA. A teacher had shown the video of his broadcast to a class of 11-year-olds. One of the students, a boy named Elijah, had quietly raised his hand and asked, "Why didn't we learn this in history books?" The teacher didn't know how to answer, but Elijah went home that night and recorded a short video on his mother's phone. With watery eyes, he looked straight at the screen and said, "Mr. Traoré, thank you for telling the truth. I didn't know black people went through so much pain for peace. I'm just a kid, but I'm listening now." Traoré watched that clip 3 times. He said nothing, but the tears that rolled down his cheeks weren't of sadness this time. They were tears of hope. He whispered, "If children are listening, then we are healing." The letter, the diary, the stories, none of it was in vain. History was no longer hiding, and a new generation had just begun to wake up. Weeks passed. Then, on a bright morning in Ouagadougou, thousands gathered in silence. Children held flowers. Elders wore their medals, some for the very first time. Today was the unveiling of a national memorial, the monument of the forgotten African soldier. At the center stood a statue, not of a warrior with a gun, but of a barefoot man holding the hand of a young boy, pointing toward the rising sun. Next to it were the names, hundreds, thousands, carved in stone, names that had once lived only in secret letters and broken family stories. Traoré stood before the crowd, wearing no military rank. He placed a single rose at the base of the statue and bowed his head. Then he spoke just one sentence. "We are no longer invisible." The world watched in silence. In Paris, in London, in Washington, people cried. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about recognition, about dignity, about healing generations. Traoré had never needed to visit the White House because he had done something far greater. He had built a house of memory for all of Africa, and the doors would never close again. The final global broadcast was unannounced. No cameras. Just Traoré sitting under a tree beside a river, wind moving softly around him. A young girl from his village sat next to him. She looked up and asked, "Uncle, why didn't you go to America?" He smiled gently and replied, "Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is to stand still in the truth." He pulled out his father's letter once more and held it up to the sky. "Papa, we didn't forget you." Then he faced the camera, softly but clearly. "I did not reject peace. I rejected silence. I did not refuse a handshake. I waited for a voice to say, 'We see you now.'" He placed a stone in the river. That stone carries the names of those who never got justice. His eyes filled with tears. But tonight, they finally rest. He stood and walked away with the little girl, hand in hand, and the screen faded to black. If this story touched your heart, If you cried, remembered someone, or felt proud of Africa, then don't scroll away in silence. Click like, write one line in the comments for the ancestors, and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories the world tried to bury. Because we are not just telling stories, we are building memory. And you, yes you,